Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, the Answer Company. The Division Championship Minnesota Twins are looking to go all the way to the World Series in 2024. Bolstered by inspirational shortstop Carlos Correa, a healthy Brian Buxton, and rookie phenom Royce Lewis, plus a pitching staff led by Pablo Lopez and an outstanding bullpen featuring Johan Duran, the Twins are the best bargain in the major leagues, and Target Field is the best venue in baseball. Sheridan Dulas & Kins, PA, a family and criminal defense law firm, has been serving clients in Dakota County and throughout Minnesota for over 40 years. Ranked a Tier 1 Best Law Firm by U.S. News and World Report every year since 2009, Sheridan Dulas & Kins are here to help you in your most difficult life circumstances. Established in 2007, 45th Parallel Spirits was among the first 50 micro-distilleries in the United States. Based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, all aspects of production occur at our facility. If you're interested in visiting and learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check our website and plan a visit to tour our facility and taste our spirits. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Access to Democracy. I'm your host, Steve Francisco. Thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to welcome back to our studio an old friend of the program, Professor Richard Logan, who in the past has hosted some of the episodes of our show. And today we are going to be talking about a very interesting subject, the state of civil society, me versus we. Richard, welcome back to Access to Democracy.
It's a pleasure being back, and I've really enjoyed some conversations we've had in the run-up to doing this program. And in the past, I've enjoyed very much working with Alan Miller and Sharon Miller. And this Access to Democracy is a wonderful program. It's covered such a range of topics over the years.
Well, thank you.
Not
just
politics.
As our cups say, this is our 25th anniversary this year, so we're very proud of this program, and Alan and Sharon have kept it going for quite some time now, so very pleased to have you here. So tell our viewers who may not be familiar with you, just briefly, where are you from? Where did you go to school? How did you end up in Minnesota?
I was born in upstate New York. I grew up in upstate Vermont, not far from Canada. Lived in small towns all through childhood and high school. I was very fortunate as a kid from a small town to be accepted to go to Harvard, where I majored in anthropology and minored in psychology. And I was very fortunate after that to be accepted at the University of Chicago in their doctoral program in interdisciplinary human development. So I've been incredibly fortunate when it comes to the education experiences I've had. My experiences in the doctoral program at the University of Chicago led directly to a teaching opportunity at the University of Nairobi, where I taught social sciences for a couple of years. As far as how we got over here to Minnesota, long story short, my wife, once we had our first grandchild born here in Minneapolis, she said, I'm moving to Minneapolis. And that's how we ended up over here.
Glad to have you here. When you and I had coffee this summer, we had a very engaging conversation, and I recall you describing yourself as a social anthropologist. Say a little bit more about that. What is a social anthropologist?
Well, a social anthropologist looks more closely at the psychology of human beings. And so I'm very interested in the kinds of life experiences that people had in village Africa and documenting that. And having spent time in Village Africa is one of the things that shaped my perspective on the topic today. I'll never forget talking with a Kikuyu elder for most of an afternoon, and hearing this elder give a doctoral level dissertation on how it is that there's never any such thing as an abandoned elder or a forgotten child. And it has to do with all of these interconnected relationships that people have. So that was an example of real community. And so that's my whole approach as an academic has been kind of on this dimension of community versus individualism, because a lot of indigenous societies are very collective in their orientation, and community is very organically real. I was really stunned when I started teaching at the University of Nairobi how many of the students there were very interested in the large-scale social sciences like political science, economics, sociology, anthropology, but they didn't care much about psychology. That's because the individual was not as organically real an entity in their life experience as it is with us. Yes.
So that's a good segue into today's title of our program. We're talking about civil society. Give us a brief description, Richard. What do we mean when we use the term civil society? What are the elements, if you will, of civil society?
Well, civil society is sometimes called the third sector of society. The first two are government and business, and then there's civil society, then there's, say, the press. And the civil society, de Tocqueville, when he wrote Democracy in America, he had quite a bit to say about what civil society is. Basically, it's the voluntary associations that people who think of themselves as public citizens get engaged in order to make their communities function better, to lobby government for things like human rights and things like that. If I could just quote something from de Tocqueville from his book written in 1835.
Was that Democracy in America?
Democracy in America, yeah. Americans of all ages, conditions, and all dispositions constantly unite together to hold fates, to found seminaries, to build inns, to construct churches, to distribute books, to dispatch missionaries to the antipodes, metaphor for a faraway place.
Right.
They establish hospitals, prisons, schools by the same method. Finally, if they wish to highlight a truth or develop an opinion by the encouragement of a great example, they form an association. So civil society is basically that wonderful array of voluntary associations.
So we're talking about philanthropy,
Yes.
We're talking about volunteerism, we're talking in the modern era, I suppose, about collective bargaining and unions trying to do better through collective bargaining process to improve their wages, their working conditions, changing labor laws perhaps. And you've mentioned too, when you've talked about civil society, that the New England Town Hall meeting, that you're from that area originally, that was really a great example, if you will, of civil society at work.
That's right. And it's also a great example of where you get that bridge between voluntary associations and government. Because we're talking about people voluntarily going to town meetings, but also participating in government at that level, and then communicate, and then some of the representatives can go on to deal with government officials at higher levels. When I look back at my childhood in Vermont and I think about adults in town, if you were an adult in a small town in Vermont, you could not avoid being a public citizen. And so one of the things that interests me now is the balance is, I would argue that the balance is shifting toward more and more a person's focus more and more on themselves as a private individual and less as a public citizen. And if people don't think about themselves as public citizens, you won't have a civil society.
Let me ask you about that.
Okay.
Why do you think that is? Let's assume for a moment that your point is correct, that people are more focused on individualism, if you will, rather than a sense of community. Why is that happening, do you believe?
Well, I think I've done some work looking at individualism over the centuries of history, and it seems to me that in the Western world, people become more and more aware of themselves as apart from the kind of context that we were talking about when we talk about community and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And say in the 1960s, you started seeing these books like How to Love Yourself, How to Be Your Own Best Friend, Get in Touch with Your Inner Child, and so on. So I actually, and then of course we have, maybe you could argue, an increase in narcissism, and we have the sovereign citizen movement where, I myself can make decisions about, how I live my life. To heck with any government rules or heck with other people. That sort of thing. That's not a complete answer. It's more descriptive than an answer.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Do you believe that media, particularly the rise of social media, online media platforms, has contributed to this new overemphasis, as you might put it, on individualism rather than a sense of community and being concerned about community more broadly?
Yeah, there's a very interesting correlation, as I see it, between this increased emphasis on the self and single issue politics. And one of the things that the social media algorithms do is they try to tease out the single kind of issue that is most interesting to a person. Then they will amplify that. So yes, I think that that's true. Plus the fact that you've got people spending more and more time in their own space, looking at a screen and doing social media, rather than interacting in the real three-dimensional world with other human beings. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
Let me push back a little bit on this idea, just to explore this a little further with you. Some people might say that it's really not that individualism has replaced a sense of community, because if you look at it, in a state like Minnesota, we have, for our size, we punch above our weight in terms of volunteerism, the number of nonprofit organizations who address all of the human condition, all the human issues that a person like de Tocqueville would have noticed in, his observations about Americans. So is it necessarily a case, it's not a case of individualism replacing a sense of community, but your concern is you think there's maybe too much emphasis on individual rights, perhaps, and not enough about community responsibility. Would that be a fair characterization?
No, that's an excellent point. I mean, there is increasingly an emphasis on individual rights, but if you think about it logically, for every right that somebody asserts, that somebody somewhere else has to guarantee that right, and oftentimes that's government, but it could also be associated. It could also be the community. I'm not arguing that community has been replaced. In fact, it's really interesting. If you look at the America that de Tocqueville was looking at in the beginning and talking about civil society is made up of these voluntary associations where people came together, that coexisted with Emerson's self-reliance and good old rugged individualism. And so, somehow there was they weren't contradictory early on. But, there was this book that came out a few decades ago called Bowling Alone and so on, that really kind of, and then there was Habits of the Heart by Robert Bellah that did argue that there's a new kind of emphasis on the self that doesn't fit as well with this concept of community. And if I could, I'm shaped by Village Africa. I'm shaped by having spent a decade working with an Amish community when I was teaching. And I'll never forget this saying of the Amish man. Somebody who's not Amish asked this Amish man, "Tell me, sir, are you a good Christian?" And the Amish man's answer is, "I don't know, ask my neighbor." Now, that's community, okay? That's community because and then the Amish live according to a principle they call joy, J-O-I, and being devout Christians from like the 1500s, J stands for Jesus, or you could also replace that with something larger than yourself. It doesn't have to be a particular religion. The O stands for the other person, and I stands for myself. So in their worldview, I come third. I don't come first, I come third. And so that is community too.
That's interesting. I want to
But
talk.
I think there's a lot of Minnesota community.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that it's gone.
And
by
it's
any
true
stretch.
not just in Minnesota, but in other
Oh,
places too.
yes.
You can
Oh, yes.
find voluntary organizations
Yeah.
and a very active nonprofit sector. I want to drill down a little bit more about this concept of individual rights. We hear a lot about it, especially in our current politics.
Yep.
We are in the midst of a very contentious, and if you believe the polling, a very close presidential election campaign that will be determined in 40-some days from now. But in that debate, we hear, for example, my Second Amendment rights, my right to own guns. Congress should make no laws that inhibit that right. And then you have people on the other side of that who say, well, wait a minute, they were in an age of dealing with flint muskets that could only fire one round, whereas today a modern semi-automatic weapon may be able to fire up to 100 rounds a minute. It's a different world.
It is a different
And
world.
so would you argue then that that maybe illustrates this type of conflict between having an individual right and also dealing with an individual right which is referenced in the Constitution in the Second Amendment, but then also this idea of don't we have a responsibility to protect people's right to be safe in the larger community?
Right, I think you said it well. And another thing I would add to what you just said is when you look at people's assertion of rights, to what extent are they taking into account the other guy and the other person? And of course, there are all kinds of arguments about, the more guns around, the more guns will fall into people who have no business having guns. I mean, so there's a whole we could do a whole show on just that one topic.
And
sure.
guns
but it's
may-
another example of a single issue political topic.
That's what I
On
was
the
gonna
other
ask you.
side, you can have somebody for whom abortion is their single issue.
Right.
Or the climate is their single issue. And one of the things that de Tocqueville was talking about was a democracy in America that took a broad view. And there's more than one issue that a community is concerned with. Yeah.
It's interesting at the beginning of our country, this concept of commonwealth.
Yes.
We have several states that are still to this day, 200 plus years later, referred to as commonwealths. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, where I lived for a while, the Commonwealth of Virginia. And that's actually a very old concept that goes way, way back in our history. This idea that you're not only an individual living in a community, but you are in a community and that people have shared responsibilities.
Yeah, and commonwealth, another way to say commonwealth is to say the common good. And even though there was rugged individualism and self-reliance and so on, the idea of the common good was far from absent from the minds of those earlier peoples, and far from absent in the tradition of, say, the New England town meeting and so on.
Right.
And the idea of having responsibilities is really, if you think of yourself as a public citizen and as a member of a community, the idea of having responsibilities is absolutely built in.
Right.
Absolutely,
I love having political discussions with people, not just people who agree with me or I agree with them, but sometimes particularly with people who see things a little bit or quite a bit differently than I do. I have a friend who identifies as a libertarian, and he and I had quite an intense discussion one day about libertarianism. And, he was embracing this idea that everything he had, he really had achieved it on his own. And I challenged him on that.
Yeah.
I said, well, how did you get here today? We met at a restaurant for lunch. I said, you drove on a public highway that was financed by taxes. Where were you educated? He was educated in public schools, again, financed by taxes.
Right.
Who takes care of our national security? Financed by taxes. And my point to him, which he was reluctant to concede, but my point to him was none of us none of us make it totally on our own, that there are other people, there are mentors, there are
Exactly.
teachers, there are institutions of government that help us to achieve success.
Yeah, and a lot of libertarians have role models who are libertarian intellectuals.
Right.
You know,
Right.
It's interesting that you say that. Johnny Clegg, this great South African singer, and we could do a whole program on him in South Africa and apartheid too. Johnny Clegg, one of his best songs was called "A Great Heart." There's a line in it that says, I know I can make it on my own if I try, but I need a great heart to stand me by." And so, you know, and that's one of the features of traditional cultures is that in the traditional setting, elders play substantial roles. Elders, one of the things I learned from Village Africa is that the major ceremonial events that mark life transitions for youth aren't directed by the parent generation, they're directed by the grandparent generation. So the wisdom of the ages is present. And yeah, I hope we can keep that
That's very
present.
interesting.
Yeah.
I want to go back to a
Good.
term that you used earlier in your remarks, Richard. You mentioned the word citizen sovereignty, and there is this sovereign citizen movement afoot in the United States, has been for a while now.
Yeah.
What is this concept of citizen sovereignty? Can you say a word about that?
That I am my own governing body. I don't need anybody to tell me what to do. And that's my understanding. You could look at it as an even more extreme iteration of the philosophy of libertarianism. I wouldn't necessarily start associating libertarians with sovereign citizens, but sovereign citizens often, as I understand it, believe in open carry. They have, you know, are a little bit more likely to have weapons.
There are videos one can see on YouTube
Yes.
of people appearing in court who start reading a manifesto saying they don't recognize the jurisdiction
Exactly.
of courts.
Yeah.
And so they therefore don't recognize government as being legitimate or having any legitimate
Yeah.
authority over them.
Right. I think it's an extreme instance
Yeah.
of a radical individualism that Robert Bellah wrote about in the book Habits of the Heart, which was a bestseller in, say, 1985 and so on.
And I would assume then, given that you would see that as very antithetical to the idea of civil society that we were talking about earlier.
Yes. And of course, there's also, the word civil means, having to do with society, but the word civil also means being civil.
Right. Right.
And we certainly see the absence of that sometimes today too.
So Salman Rushdie did an interview with the journalist Bill Moyers on PBS a few years back, and he said a quote that you and I have talked about. He said something very interesting. He said, quote, "Democracy is an ongoing argument about what is right."
Yes.
And I assume you think he's right about that point.
Yeah, and an ongoing argument. Of course, the word argument can oftentimes mean something contentious.
Right.
But the word argument, when it's used in people who write about the topic we're talking about, has to do with argument as a debate. And it's
As an idea.
Yeah, and it's supposed to be a reasoned debate. That's why, in order to be a public citizen, one has to be well educated. One has to have, ideally, one of the things that Tocqueville pointed out was that if you've participated in voluntary associations prior to say getting into government and so on, you have a sense of being civil and interacting with other people and so on.
And I want to ask you about this other term that we sometimes see come up in the context of discussions about civil society, and that is the term communitarianism. And let me say straight up, we are not talking about communism.
That's
That
exactly
is something
right.
very different, which people often confuse. Say a word, if you would, about what does this mean, communitarianism?
Communitarianism is a movement and a perspective that was developed by the sociologist Amitai Etzioni, E-T-Z-I-O-N.
I'm assuming Italian.
I'm not sure about that. But the whole idea of communitarianism really goes back to this concept that you brought about, citizen responsibility. And they recognize, and one of the things they try to do in communitarianism is balance rights with responsibilities, because as I said before, for every person or body that asserts rights, there has to be some other person or body that guarantees those rights.
And
you can't be a citizen without being responsible.
Right.
Yes.
I saw Etzioni made an interesting observation, I believe. He says it's all about balance, and notes that we've codified very few responsibilities in law, that
That's
the
right.
American tradition have been, there are certain things like jury duty. In time of war, it may be military service. And when you contrast that with the enumeration of rights that we have, beginning with the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, the difference is huge, yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
that's a very interesting thing, isn't it? So my question to you, I guess, we're down to about 3 minutes. I'd be curious about your thoughts about how do we achieve balance as a society between recognizing and protecting individual rights and liberties versus this sense of the collective good or communitarianism?
Well, I think one of the best examples is honoring what a lot of people are doing at the local level. Say, I've belonged to a neighborhood association for a long time. The city of Minneapolis has over 70 neighborhood associations, and they are good examples of people working hard to model being responsible as a resident of the city, and not just modeling somebody who's trying to say, I have the right to open carry or something like that. Yeah, so but I think it's a tough nut to crack. But I think the fact that Minnesota has such a high voter turnout every year is another example.
We usually lead the nation.
Yes, absolutely.
Highest turnout.
Yep. That's a great example of modeling being responsible and thinking of yourself as a citizen.
And I would have to observe too, I think part of that, Richard, I suspect you might agree with me, it's partly because of our election laws, that we have same-day voter registration. People can vote on the very same day. If they're not registered to vote, they can get registered and participate in our elections. We have a long tradition of making it easier for people to vote, as opposed to many states that we see which are actually moving in the opposite direction.
More and more so recently,
Right,
yes.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting issue. Well, any final thoughts? We're down to about a minute here, and I'm curious, what wins out in the end? Will we still be able to preserve our democracy with this sense of community, or are we all going to go our separate ways toward some kind of radical individualism?
It's a tough call. I'm worried that in other circumstances like this over history, what has happened is you get authoritarian government as a way of providing order and so on. And of course, that's the antithesis of
the strong man, if you will, who says, I can solve all of your problems, just give me power.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm concerned about that for sure. But there are many people who are modeling the kind of thing that de Tocqueville talked about and what you and I have been discussing.
Right. We are going to continue this discussion sometime in the future, but for now, Professor Richard Logan, anthropologist, thank you for being our guest today on Access to Democracy to discuss civil society. Thank you for being with us.
Great pleasure. Thank you.